pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Can you please make sure that your phones are either on silent or turned off? All right, seeing that we have no one for public forum, Mr. Van Orman, if you want to, for our first presentation.
Sure. So just as a continuation of our budget building process, I know last meeting a couple weeks ago, Danielle kind of presented the first round of our administrative preliminary budget information. So in keeping with the adopted budget calendar, we're bringing you some updated information in that administrative piece, and then we're adding in the program components as well, just kind of layering in, building in the steps that are associated with putting together a school budget. So we'll turn it over to Danielle and her PowerPoint.
Thank you. So before I actually get started on the prepared presentation, I did want to give a brief update on the governor's runs for our aid. So in my last presentation, I had estimated about $18.4 million for New York State aid. The governor's runs are estimating about 18.7. The reason my estimates are lower is because our expense-based aids usually come in actually lower than what is reflected in those runs. For us, the governor's numbers represent a 3.63% increase over last year's aid. And just a very, in the presentation, you'll see that the estimates for revenue are flatter for increase than that, because in the past we've overestimated our revenues and we actually haven't collected that much. So when you see those numbers from the state saying we're going to get a 3.63% increase, just keep in mind that we're doing some right sizing on that revenue side as well. So to open up, just a reminder of what is reflected in the budget calendar. Next up, we have the capital component, an update on our revenues, and then as well at that point, I'll give a full overview of the three components we've talked about, as well as any changes that may have occurred since these presentations. So an update on the administrative component, some slight changes from the last presentation. We've incorporated a few items for professional development, some contractual contingencies that weren't accounted for. One of the bigger changes you'll see here is in personnel. The Labor Relations Service had been accounted for under public information and it should have been moved up here. So we made that change, as well as updating some of the BOCES rates based on estimates from prior year expenditures. Again, those rates still aren't finalized by the BOCES yet, so we may have some changes moving forward, but this gives an estimate of where we're at. We also had a little bit of adjustment here in supervision and curriculum development, again, to account for some of those professional development opportunities and making sure that our team can stay current with what's going on in the state. Again, this is what's included in that component. So no major changes to staffing, anything like that. Again, the BOCES costs are still in flux. We're still working on that. But we're in the middle of conducting that needs assessment that we talked about last time. Should be wrapping up soon for most of our coasters. And then as those rates come in from BOCES, it'll be a quick update since that needs assessment is already done. All right, the meat and potatoes of tonight. So for the program component, just a brief overview of what we're seeing in each of those individual areas. So some right sizing items. The first thing I want to talk about is that technology budget. So in the technology budget we talked about last time for BOCES, that's that computer assisted instruction. We had projected last year for the BOCES cost $525,000 and we had spent approximately $1 million. So this right sizing here between 643 and $1 million, the vast majority of that is that same BOCES cost that we talked about last time. In the professional development category, you'll see from $73,000 to $103,000. We spent last year $104,000. So this actually represents a very slight decrease in projection. But again, just right sizing those budgeted figures to where we actually anticipate landing at the end of the year. We have a slight increase in teaching in regular schools and a decrease in students with disabilities. So we had been ending the year with available funds in the special education budget. And then we had needed money in the regular education budget. Those funds have been transferred in the past. So just again, starting out with a higher allocation in the regular education and a lower in the special ed, right sizing to where our expenditures are. Teaching special schools, there is a sharp decrease there. That's based on our actual expenditures. So last year we spent about $54,000 in that code. We talked about the computer assisted instruction.
Danielle, I don't mean to interrupt. The teaching special schools, what is that?
So special schools is really our summer programming. Typically, it's the non-extended school year for students with disabilities programming. That's paid for out of our special aid fund, our federal fund, and we do get reimbursed 80% for that program.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Danielle, so speaking on that, it's also P-TECH and other schools, and do we have an alt-ed program that we send students to BOCES?
So we do have a CTE program,
Okay,
but
so,
not separated, right?
but the special schools typically is also the alt-ed program through the BOCES.
So as of right now, we don't have anything in our existing billing. As part of that needs assessment, we're projecting those enrollment figures for the future year. So if we anticipate trying to place a student in one of those programs, that number would change, but as of right now, this is where we're at right now. So these numbers will fluctuate a little as we go through, get that information from the directors and from the departments, but for the most part, this gives us where we are right now with the students we have right now, what we're spending right now, projected out for the next year to give that nice foundation for us. So teaching support services, really not a huge change there, mostly just incrementation for cost of services. Same thing for pupil personnel services. That's largely our SRO. Co-curriculars, so you'll see a slight decrease here. This is same thing as we talked about with that right sizing. In the past, we really hadn't been spending that full $71,000. The reason for that being we have some activities that are inside the contracts that haven't been run. So we have a few things that had been budgeted for, but we realistically hadn't spent. This does account for, the addition of those activities if they were to come back in, but it gives a little bit more realistic number for us instead of continuing to increase and increase and increase. The athletics budget is largely stable. Some of that has to do with breakage in the supervisor position there. It's partially grant funded, so we're seeing a little bit less in the general fund for that. And we are as well seeing activities resume their levels pre-COVID. So this brings us back to a more regular number. In the transportation and bus garage, we do have a larger increase. We did have an issue getting drivers a couple of years ago, so now we have the bus garage fully staffed. These numbers reflect the cost of that full staffing, as well as the cost for substitute coverage when we need it, so that we can make sure that the kids are still being brought to school on time and safely, as well as some regular increases for our gas and electric and things like that. So sort of regular CPI increases as well as accounting for that staffing. The employee benefits, we talked a little bit about this with the administrative component, so I'm projecting them to go down, not because anybody has stopped taking benefits, but because in the past we had ended with a surplus in that code. So just again, making sure we're right sizing, the figures we're projecting here are accurate, and that we're not ending the year with a pot of money in one code or another. The transfer to special aid fund, that's that extended school year program we talked about a little bit. So we do get 80% reimbursement from the state for that program. We were responsible for the 20%. So this transfer to special aid would represent our 20% share. In the past, we had budgeted about $3,000 for it. That has not covered our local share. So we are increasing it to match what we expect that program to actually cost us. And then overall, you'll see that the total number here is pretty flat, 17.6 to 17.8. That accounts for some of that right sizing. A lot of it has occurred within the program budget itself. And again, this is one of the larger expenses in this area, so the decrease in the benefit projection has contributed highly to this remaining stable. Alright, so what's included in all of those numbers? Those are everyone that you can think of being in the classroom. That is not an exhaustive list, but it includes our monitors, our teachers, our teaching assistants, aides, all of those wonderful people, approximately 183 staff members as of this point in time. So this program component is the majority of our budget. The majority of what we spend is directly in this area, as well as the salaries and benefits, of course, being the largest part within this. So we're spending on who's in the room with our kids, more or less. All right, so what's next in our process to keep us on track? The third and final component is going to be that capital component. That's a smaller component. The program is the biggest bit for us. Again, that completion of a needs assessment. So we are finishing up our BOCES services review. The program review is going to be the enrollment, the staffing, where are we at as a district in terms of both the strategic plan and the curriculum work that we've been doing to realign things within the district. The third bit within that is the equipment component. So you'll notice that every year we go out and we purchase buses. Those have been paid for through a bus reserve, not through this general fund budget that you'll see here. It's an appropriation of that through a separate proposition. So just keep in mind that that's not necessarily reflected in these numbers because it's approved as a separate proposition. And then as well, to continue a replacement plan to make sure that we're not spending a large amount of money in equipment in any one year, spacing that out over time so that we keep things stable. And after all that, we'll talk about reviewing the whole. So where do we look like in total between revenue and all these projected expenditures that you've seen? So I'll give you a total number for each of the three components, show you where we're at, and talk about how we might balance those scales if there is a gap. So we fared pretty well in the governor's numbers. We did show that 3.63% increase. A lot of other districts in our area were looking at decreases. So we were in a more favorable position this time around. But we have been using fund balance and reserves for a couple of years to close a gap. So that means that we're starting out this budget season already behind that starting line. So when we talk about closing that gap, how does it happen? There's usually three main ways to do it. The first is raising the tax levy, which of course we have a tax cap, so we want to look at that, see what's available there. That's not going to close the size of gap that we have. We started 23-24 appropriating $1.2 million. So that's pretty sizable for a district of our budget size, and we want to make sure that we look at correcting that so that we can continue offering the programs we offer for a long time. The second way besides raising the tax levy is making cuts, readjusting our expenditures, doing some of the right sizing to make sure that we're using our resources most efficiently. And the third way to close that gap is what we have been doing, which is using fund balance and reserves. And the reason I want to talk about that is because we have those reserves from years where we were able to end the year with some funds, set them aside for a rainy day. We've been using those rainy day funds and they will run out. So we want to get back into a position where at the end of the year we're able to make sure that we have those emergency funds for a future day. I will say $1.2 million, I wouldn't expect to close that gap this year. I would expect still some appropriation of fund balance and reserves, but doing that gentle right sizing to get us back on track so that we are able to be in a strong fiscal position for many years from now. Okay. All right, so up next, that continued collaboration, making sure that we're working together to validate all the numbers, validate all the enrollments, talk about what fits our students best, that presentation I talked about. And then on March 6th, so between February 7th, where you'll get an update of everything, and then March 6th, we'll have another update of all the components of the budget, so that you can see in this budget development process what's changed and why, where are we at, answer any questions, make sure that the priorities that we have as a district are reflected in the budget we're putting out. That's all I have for you. If you have any other questions.
I have some questions.
Okay.
So your curriculum and development is going down, but your next, on the next page, is going up for your professional development. Is curriculum and development going down and moving to your
not. So this curriculum development code is largely the assistant superintendent's office, and that position is partially grant funded. And before there were 2 positions in that administrative component, now there's only the one, and it's partially grant funded. So that's really the decrease.
So is professional development increasing due to the Biden-Bucks expiration?
I wouldn't say so, because this is the budget that we started with, the 73,000, but even with the Biden bucks last year, we spent 104 out of the general fund. So this is more a reflection of PD existing outside of those activities than anything else.
So with the Biden-Bucks expiring, are those folks who are in them, are they currently in this budget here?
So the main positions, yes. So the instructional coaches, those have been included into these baseline numbers. Some of those stipends that were used to support the MTSS work we've been doing in district, those are reflected in these baseline figures. My thought is to show if we continued everything, what would our gap look like? And then make decisions from there.
Okay.
So with this layout, then we're not showing any cuts from the Biden bucks going away.
Correct.
Okay.
And then for your transfer, no, that's fine. For special aid, just FYI, because this is Red Creek's first year for CEP, if your school lunch has a deficit, you cannot take it from the school lunch fund balance to offset it. You're required, when you submitted the paperwork, to pay for it out of the general. So if the 10,000 is truly for special aid, you might want to consider putting something in there for school lunch for that offset, for a just in case.
And this is outside of the excess fund balance.
Yes, you cannot use the fund that to make yourself whole.
Right.
And then just for board purposes, I know this is a lot, it's a lot to take in, but for the past few years, they've had very low levy increases here. They haven't been going to the cap, but with what's going on with our financials, it's something that's, you might need to hear, and I don't know what your cap is for this year, but you might need to actually go above a 2% and go to your cap, which is wise budgeting practices. So, just, thank you so much.
Any other questions? Thank you, Danielle. Okay, we're gonna move on. I take a motion for the regular meeting minutes from January 10th. Mrs. Folds, and a second, Mrs. Kaiser. Any questions, corrections on these? All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, moving on. I take a motion for the consent agenda, everything with the exception of D3, number 5.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Dingman, and a second. Thank you, Mrs. Bliss. Any questions? When you're ready.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Folds? Yes. Mrs. Dingman?
Yes?
Mrs. Decker?
Yes.
Mrs. Bliss?
Yes.
Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
And Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Mr. Knowlton, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I would take a motion for D3-5. Mrs. Allen, second by Mrs. Dingman. Mr. Vanderman?
Great, so, this is, one of the first times I've had an opportunity to kind of talk about somebody, who has, dedicated quite a bit of time for us. I believe it's 18 years in the district. They've spent some additional time outside of the district, but I wanted to give Mrs. DeVinny an opportunity to speak on Aileen's behalf as well, just because of their close working relationships.
So I think first and foremost, I have to tell you, Aileen is the best kind of human being. She is the first to show up with a lending ear, a hug, are you gonna be okay? She is the absolute best kind of human being that we will miss tremendously. She has worked the last 6 years as a data clerk in the curriculum office, and prior to that spent 13 very stressful years as a payroll clerk. I'm sure Jolene can attest to that loving presence that she has. This year, with a transition of roles, her office moved from the way far end of the high school down here to the business office. And she has been the mama hen in the business office to really see that group of individuals through transitions. She's really helped to unify them and also help them to realize that everything we do day in and day out is for the students. She is consistently the person to go above and beyond to say, this is for the kids. I know it's hard, but this is for the kids. And I hope that that is what this district remembers her for, and that becomes her legacy, that every single one of us show up every day to do what's best for the kids, because that is truly her purpose here, and we will, as I said, we will miss her. But we're very happy to see that she was just approved as a substitute, so maybe we'll give her February 1st off, and February 2nd have her come back in.
I'll say a couple of words. I worked with Aileen for about 12 years in the district office here, when I was the treasurer here and she was the payroll clerk, and highly dedicated individual. She was here all the time, before me, after me, weekend, Saturday, Sunday. She was always here, making sure doing good work is something that was really important to her. It was important to her to make sure everybody's pay was correct. But I would second what Jen said about the kids. She just adores the kids. She'd go down to get lunch, and she'd come back and she'd tell me these stories about the little kiddos that she would see along the way. And she stayed because she loves the kids, for sure. She'll be missed around here, and I'm glad that she was able to come back down here and help rebuild and be that voice of history for the district office down here, because there's been so much turnover in that office over the past few years that there wasn't really anybody left that was here. So I'm really glad she was able to come back and say, hey guys, this is what we're all about down here. So, but I was so excited to hear she was retiring, because she deserves it.
Anybody got anything else? I like her a lot, so thank you for letting her retire. I hope she's watching. I suggested that she did. She said, I don't want to cry. I'm like, well, Jen has that effect on me. Yeah,
Don't cry.
I know. When you're ready.
Okay, Mrs. Decker?
Yes.
Mrs. Bliss?
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
Mrs. Foltz?
Yes.
And then Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Thank you.
We couldn't stop her from retiring.
I
I
tried.
believe they've tried. 'Cause I feel like it would be inappropriate to say that Matt threw down her resignation letter, but we'll see what happens. I saw it. She jumped right in to come back, so. Okay, we'll move on to new business.
Can I make a motion for E 1, 2, and 3?
I will take that. Can I have a second, please, Mrs. Kaiser? Any questions? When you're ready.
Mrs. Foltz?
Yes.
Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Bliss?
Yes.
Mrs. Decker? And Mrs. Madigan?
Yes, thank you. I would take a motion for E4 through 7 or any combination, please.
I'll
Mrs. Foltz, 4 through 7. A second, Mrs. Bliss, thank you. Any questions on this group? When you're ready.
Okay, Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Decker?
Yes.
Mrs. Foltz?
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Bliss?
Yes.
And Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Van Orman, did you have anything else for us tonight?
No, I just think, in addition to Danielle's conversation, right, there's the governor's proposal for the budget, executive budget just came out. So there's been a lot of unpacking, both at the business official level and at the superintendent level. As Danielle indicated, some of the districts really saw a negative increase or a decrease. So we were fortunate not to see that. But now you're starting to see some advocacy wrap up with some of the different agencies. Another challenge that we're going to be faced with, so that uncertainty of that 3.63% increase over last year is what's being proposed. Of course, that's not locked in at this point. One of the challenges being that it's an election year for a lot of our elected officials. It's going to complicate the timeline in which those numbers come back to the districts. So as we finish up through this budget process, a lot of these things are going to be projections as opposed to concrete numbers. And as we all know, sometimes in politics, there's like last minute changes that could impact either positively or negatively. So we're trying to be as judicious as we can with understanding where all of those numbers interplay with each other and what the impact is on our programs with those. So, stay tuned a little bit. I think you've been seeing it in the news. You'll see some of the advocacy groups start to ramp up asking for different things. So, education is always a hot button topic with elected officials. So hopefully maybe we can see a little bit of an increase in that. And then that will just give us a little bit more of a buffer that might reduce our dependency on that fund balance reserve. So, just kind of stay tuned. That's very fluid at this point.
Thank you. Okay, with nothing else, I'd take a motion
I
to.
have one
Yep.
thing I wanted to bring up real. I just happened to
Nancy
think.
was just actually waving
She
at me,
was
so you're
so
totally
close.
fine.
Has the board considered at any point in time having a student board member?
So we actually have talked about that several different occasions, and it never really came to fruition, but I will say that the students in the room, that's also a new thing.
Right,
So
that's what
maybe-
kind of made me think about it. We've been seeing students in the room a lot,
Yeah.
and,
So maybe it's something that
I
with-
know it's required for their course,
Yeah.
but
But we are really fun, right guys?
with
they can't wait to come back.
I think it's Mr. Clement now
It
who
is.
teaches that course, so maybe it's something that the administrative staff could talk to him about at some point, because I don't think he's taught it. I know he hasn't taught it forever because he didn't teach me, but maybe it could be a possibility in the future.
Just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, I don't see anybody raising their hand in the back either. So
They also picked a good one to come to.
I was gonna say, yeah, you're lucky, guys. You're lucky. So all right, without
Very
anything
cool.
else, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Dingman. Is that a yes? Okay, and a second by Mrs. Decker. Thank you, guys.